In January 2014, the sheriff of a small town in Oregon discovered something on a farm that shocked all the residents. The discovery was so eerie that it could have been the basis for the most sophisticated horror films. Susan Monica led an ordinary lifestyle that many might even consider successful. She had several close friends and a good job as an engineer. Susie also lived in one of the most impressive cities, San Francisco, California. However, despite all this, Monica was not satisfied. The fact was that moving to a big city was more of a necessity than a dream for Susie, given the developing circumstances. Ultimately, the move allowed her to work and earn good money. In reality, Susan preferred peace and tranquility. She loved being alone. But living in such a big city was not easy. Every evening when she came home from work, she sat in her favorite chair and dreamed. She dreamed of moving away, settling somewhere in a village far from the hustle and bustle, farming, growing vegetables, and raising animals, ensuring a decent life for herself. One day in 1991, when Susan was already 43 years old, her dream came true. She managed to earn and save money, enabling her to buy a farm with 8 acres of land. The farm was located in the forest in Weimar, Oregon. In reality, it was a small house without a barn for animals, without running water, and not even with electricity, a hut surrounded by wilderness without even neighbors. But for Susie, who was tired of city life, this purchase was perfect. Nature was far from people. Moreover, the woman was of strong build and a professional engineer with experience. She knew how to build a home effectively, cost-efficiently, and comfortably. Susan was not afraid of physical work. Within a few months, the neglected plot of land in the forest turned into a neatly built small farm with many stalls for animals. The woman also built a cozy house where she lived. Susie began raising pigs, adding new breeds to the herd every month. However, after establishing a household, she realized it was very difficult for her to manage it alone. She had to get up early every morning, prepare food for the animals, and clean the stalls. The work was hard. Besides, she had several other projects and simply not enough hands for everything. Susan Monica realized that no matter how much she wanted to spend time alone, she needed to find helpers whom she could pay for fulfilling some tasks. She printed flyers announcing that she was ready to hire someone to take care of the animals. Soon, people started coming to her company. Most of them were not very well off, for example, people who had difficulty finding a permanent job due to a series of problems, issues with documents, a criminal record, or a nomadic lifestyle. Few people were willing to hire such individuals for official jobs, but for Susie, it didn't matter. The only thing that concerned her was that her pigs were fed, the stalls were cleaned, and the workers did not bother her with their attention. Over the next 20 years, Susan Monica would employ several hundred workers. Workers came and went, most not staying long. Some saw the farm work as a part-time job for 1 or 2 weeks. Others managed to work for the woman for several months, but they were always people constantly searching for a better life. After the hired workers left her farm, she knew nothing about their further fate. Every time Susan found herself without assistance, she would post ads throughout the town again to find laborers. Almost everyone in the small town knew Monica as a woman fixated on her farm and always selling fresh meat. On January 1st, 2014, Susan, who was 66 years old at the time, was working in front of her hut, cleaning up the chaos. When she heard noises, she looked up and saw a car approaching her house. Susan was surprised. She lived in the forest and still had no neighbors. Guests came very rarely, usually by appointment, but this time she was expecting no one. The car stopped next to her. 3 young people got out of the car, 2 men and a woman. The strangers were the first to start a conversation. It turned out that the 3 were looking for their father, Robert Haney, who had previously told them he was working on Susan's farm. Earlier, Robert used to visit his children at least every few months. Now, they hadn't heard from their father for 6 months. Since Robert had no permanent residence and no personal phone, the youngsters had no way to contact their father. So they decided to personally search for Haney to make sure everything was fine with their father. Susan Monica was shown a photo of a man and asked if she knew Robert. He might still be working for her or had quit, but Susan might know where he could be. This visit was a complete surprise for her. She had never had guests before, and the woman treated the visitors attentively, even though she didn't like communicating with strangers. Susan said that last spring, she indeed hired a man named Robert. Haney also had a dog he cherished. The man performed his duties diligently, was efficient, and not intrusive. But 5 months later, in August, Robert changed drastically. He started abusing alcohol, avoided work, and was constantly confused. Susan was annoyed by the presence of a drinking man on her property. She told him to leave her farm as Monica no longer wanted to work with him. The next day, Robert Haney approached the owner, handed her an envelope with money, said he had to leave for a while, and asked Susan to take care of his dog in his absence. After that, the man left, and Monica never heard from Robert again. It turned out that Haney's belongings were still stored in a trailer on the farm: clothes, personal notebooks. But one thing especially caught the youngsters' attention: their father's tool belt. Robert worked part-time with repairs all his life, and it was very strange that he disappeared for 4 months without taking his tools with him. The youngsters thanked Susan and asked her to immediately inform them by phone if she had any information about their father. After leaving the farm, Robert's children went straight to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office to file a missing person report. The police took their statement, but immediately said it was difficult to find a person without permanent registration and without a personal mobile phone. However, since crimes were common in the area, the officers were interested in Robert Haney's personality. Maybe the man, who led an unstable lifestyle, did something illegal and was now hiding from everyone. The young people were asked to recall every detail that could help the investigators find the man. At some point, Robert's son remembered that his father had a social card on which money was deposited monthly, and from which he received state benefits. The card could be used to buy things, which was at least something. It took a few days to track the transactions. It turned out the card was used in a store near Susan's farm just a month ago. When the investigators checked the surveillance cameras in the grocery store, it became clear that Robert did not shop there. But on that day, Susan Monica shopped at the supermarket, using Haney's social card, which was very suspicious. When they returned to the police station, the officers immediately obtained a search warrant for the farm where the woman lived. A few days later, on January 10th, the sheriff and his deputies arrived at Susan Monica's property. The woman met the police at the door and was hospitable. The officers reported that they had come in connection with the case of the missing Robert Haney to search her property. The sheriff asked Susan to show him around the house, while the rest of the police stayed in the yard and began inspecting the area outside the house. The sheriff and Susan sat in the kitchen and started talking. The woman repeated the same story she had told Robert's children. But when the officer pointed out that Susan had recently used Haney's social security card, the woman said, "Oh yes, I forgot to mention, Robert gave me his card along with the envelope of money, so I could buy food for his dog since the dog was still with me, and I had to feed and take care of it." Susan also added that she couldn't use Robert's card if she had stolen it because she needed a PIN code, and the man had given her the password himself. The sheriff was skeptical and continued asking questions to confuse her. But Susan Monica spoke confidently and remained steadfast in her answers. In the end, the sheriff concluded that the farm owner was likely telling the truth. The case seemed to be at a dead end, and there was nothing to complain about. The officer stood up, thanked Susan for the conversation, and was about to leave. At that moment, his assistant ran into the house, leaned over to the sheriff, and whispered something in his ear. The officer turned pale at the information he received. He looked at Susan in horror and said, "You need to come with us to the police station." While she was in the interrogation room, Susan looked agitated. She didn't understand what was going on and why she was detained. The investigators then turned on the surveillance cameras and asked her a question. "Has there ever been a case where a person died on the premises of your farm?" Susan stared at the investigator for about a minute, seemingly not knowing what to say. But after a pause, the woman began her story. Everything Susan Monica had previously said about the missing Robert Haney was true, except for one small detail she had overlooked. After Robert left her farm 6 months ago, he recently returned, which was a month ago. One early morning, Susan woke up to feed her animals. When she entered the pigsty, she saw a strange sight. Normally, the pigs would lie lazily, waiting for food, but not this time. That morning, the animals were gathered in a part of the pen, seemingly surrounding something and trying to examine it with interest. When Susan realized something odd was happening, she began to push the pigs away, and as she reached the center, she saw Robert. The man was lying on his back with his intestines torn out. But the most shocking part was that Robert was still conscious, groaning, and moving his hand. Susan tried to pull Robert out, but her animals behaved aggressively, continuing to attack the victim and tear pieces off him. The woman realized it was impossible to save Haney and decided to ease the unfortunate man's suffering. Susan returned to the house, grabbed her gun, went back to the pigsty, and shot Robert, thus performing an act of mercy by ending Haney's suffering. She then collected Robert's remains in bags and threw them into a trash heap in her barn. It's evident that the man's remains were still there because during the search, a police officer entered Susan's house and whispered to the sheriff, "Sir, we found a human leg." It was Robert's leg, and it was found not in a trash heap, but in the middle of the yard, out in the open. Most likely, a wild animal sneaked into the barn and dragged the bag with the man's remains out. When asked why she didn't call the emergency services when she found Robert, Susan replied that she was afraid her pigs would be punished after the incident. The animals could simply be put down, and in that case, Susan would lose her main source of income. Even if the pigs weren't euthanized, the news of the incident would quickly spread throughout the village, and people in the area would simply refuse to buy meat from her. Susan Monica was subjected to a lie detector test. During the test, the woman constantly fidgeted and coughed, trying to ensure that the readings she provided were inaccurate. The procedure had to be stopped. Susan was warned that her entire farm would be searched if she didn't stop resisting the investigation. If the investigators managed to find something she hadn't already told them, the woman would be in serious trouble. At that moment, Susan Monica stopped fidgeting. She looked at the police officers, and after a long pause, she asked for a piece of paper and a pen, after which she began diligently drawing something on the paper. After a while, it became clear that Susan was drafting a plan of her farm. Then she placed a large cross in the middle and said, "If you go to this place, you'll find Steve here." Everyone in the room was surprised. It was about Robert. Who was Steve, and what did he have to do with it? It turned out that Steve had worked on her farm in 2012 before Susan hired Robert. Initially, he was also very efficient, but then the woman caught the employee stealing. Steve wanted to steal the owner's gun. At that moment, there was a struggle between Steve and Susan, during which the gun accidentally went off in the man's hands. Steve fell wounded in the middle of the pigsty. Suddenly, the pigs attacked the unfortunate man and began to tear him to pieces. The woman didn't call the police either, fearing her pigs would be harmed and she would lose her income. The villagers would definitely refuse to buy fresh meat from her. In fact, there was no evidence contradicting her stories, no matter how unbelievable the farm owner's tales about what happened to Robert and Steve were. When Susan stood trial, her fate was entirely in the hands of the jury. It was only a matter of whether the people in the courtroom would believe her story, and they did not. On April 21st, 2015, a year after Robert Haney was reported missing, Susan was convicted of murder and abuse of the victim's body in 2 cases. The woman was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Later, it turned out that about 17 more people were missing in the area. These were men who did not lead a very prosperous lifestyle and could have worked on Susan Monica's farm at different times. However, no evidence or other remains were found during the search of the woman's farm, so the disappearance of these people remains a mystery to everyone.
This case took place in Mexico. Maria Trinidad Ramirez Poblano was born in 1926 in the city of Tecate in northern Mexico. Maria Trinidad only completed elementary school because she had to start working at an early age. She married young and soon became the mother of a little girl. Maria Trinidad named her daughter Maria Elena. 4 more children followed, 3 boys named Pedro, Mario, and Guillermo, and another girl named Rina. Maria was used to hard work and did whatever was necessary to provide for her family. She sold tamales, cornmeal tortillas with various fillings, and atole, a thick drink made from corn kernels that resembles a porridge. After lunch and well into the late evening, Maria would sit in the kitchen preparing her famous tamales and atole. She usually prepared at least 200 servings and left the house early the next day to sell them. Maria, or La Tamalera, as her customers affectionately called her, had her own wooden cart to transport her goods. She usually stood near a bakery in one of the city's popular neighborhoods. After some time, Maria divorced her husband when she found out that he had repeatedly cheated on her. From then on, the responsibility for feeding her children fell entirely on his shoulders. Shortly after the divorce, Maria met a man named Pablo Diaz Ramirez, the owner of the barbershop where she would occasionally take her children. One day, the man spoke to Maria and asked if she knew anyone who could do his laundry. Without hesitation, Maria offered to help and gave Pablo her address so he could bring her whatever needed washing. For almost 2 months, the working relationship gradually developed into a friendship, and Maria washed and ironed for him more and more often. In 1968, after a few months of friendship, Pablo decided to take the initiative and began courting Maria. At that time, he was not the only one showing interest in the 42-year-old woman. Another man named Jesus Avel Nunez had been buying as many tamales from her as possible for a long time. At some point, Jesus found the courage to propose to Maria, but to his misfortune, she was already in love with Pablo. Maria was not put off by Pablo Diaz's dark past. Before long, Maria and her 4 underage children moved into Pablo's house. At first, everything went well. Maria continued selling her food, and Pablo worked in a barbershop. After some time, however, Pablo began working less and spending more time at home. Eventually, he spent all day lying on the sofa. During that time, Maria continued to work hard to support her family. Pablo took most of Maria's money and used it at his discretion, leaving her only enough to cover family expenses and the ingredients for her meals. It seemed that Pablo's dark side was becoming more and more apparent. Pablo had multiple previous convictions and had served several prison sentences. In 1937, he beat up a man and went to prison for it. 6 years after this incident, in 1943, he was in prison again, this time for raping and beating a young woman. At the time of these events, Pablo was 50 years old and lived under various first and last names, often changing his identity. Sometimes he introduced himself as Pablo Rington or Rafael Diaz Ramirez, trying to hide his criminal past. In an attempt to change his life, Pablo once tried to apply for a job with the police but was rejected for obvious reasons. After that, he got the idea to use fake names and surnames, but that didn't help him and he ended up in prison again. Pablo loved boxing and wrestling, and in prison he became interested in gambling. After his release, his fascination with it only grew. His image as an honest businessman with a barbershop coexisted well with his dark side. Over time, the illusion of family life faded, especially when Pablo began to show his hidden qualities. He turned out to be a narcissistic, cruel man who cared only about himself and his needs as a man. First, he stopped working altogether, claiming the barbershop wasn't bringing in enough money. Then Pablo lived off Maria, taking advantage of her earnings. After all that, he began to abuse the children. In other words, the situation in the house worsened day by day. Moreover, Pablo had full control over the proceeds from Maria's sales. All the money went to him. Of the 120 pesos Maria earned every day, Pablo left her only 15 pesos, which, at that time, was less than $1. Maria literally had to accomplish the impossible with this amount, covering the family's needs and buying ingredients for tamales. Pablo, on the other hand, led a life of idleness, spending his money on bets, boxing matches, and women. Maria suspected that he was also cheating on her, although she had no way to confirm it. Maria's and her children's lives were a tragedy. She bore a heavy burden, with every household responsibility and expense falling on his shoulders. Above all, she was tormented by the fact that her children were regularly beaten and abused. This could not go on any longer. On Saturday, July 17, 1971, Maria was cooking tamales as she did every evening. Pablo came home drunk and angry. When he heard the commotion the children were making, he became furious. Once again, he beat the boys. Guillermo, who was only 6 years old, got the worst of it. The boys were not doing anything out of the ordinary. They were just playing like old children, jumping on the bed. But Pablo was prone to violence, and every blow resonated in Maria's head and heart, making her feel like she would faint from the pain for her children. She wanted to intervene, but she knew it would only make things worse. She had no choice but to pray it would be over soon. The beating stopped only when Pablo lost interest and sent the children to bed. Maria went to comfort them, and soon they fell asleep. Around 8:30 p.m., Maria returned to the living room. Pablo told her that he wanted to leave her and that she should go if she didn't want him to keep beating the boys. Pablo had never been gentle with the children, but that night's beating was horrific. Maria didn't respond and went to the kitchen to continue her preparations for the next day. When she returned to the living room, it was 10:30 p.m. Pablo was lying half asleep on the couch, watching TV. Maria was once again reminded of what had happened just a few hours before, the debts, the cheating, and other problems. She was overcome with rage and hatred. For a while, Maria just stood there looking at Pablo, who was lying in front of the TV, appearing to doze off. Then, impulsively, she grabbed a baseball bat that belonged to Pablo and delivered the first blow to his head. After that first hit, Pablo woke up. Frightened, Maria thought that if she kept hitting him, he would try to attack her, so she struck him a second time on the head, much harder. Pablo then lost consciousness. Maria stepped aside and picked up an axe. She looked into the children's room to make sure they were still asleep, then returned to the living room and noticed Pablo was still alive, even though he was unconscious. She panicked because she didn't know what to do next. Finally, she decided to finish what she had started and get rid of Pablo once and for all. Maria went over to Pablo and hacked off his legs. Then she cut off his hands. She tried to put the remains into a corn sack, but even dismembered, Pablo wouldn't fit. Maria grabbed the axe again and this time cut off his head, throwing it into a large container filled with sunflower oil. Maria's children, accustomed to the noise she made at night while cooking, remained asleep. Pablo's torso and limbs almost fit into the sack, she only had to sever the feet. Maria hid the sack containing Pablo's remains under the bed and placed the container with his head there as well. She then began thinking about how to get rid of everything. All night long, Maria scrubbed the living room, washed away all the blood, cleaned the axe, washed her clothes, and took a shower. Then she went to work with her cart. While she was selling tamales, the horror of the previous night caught up with her again. Maria feared one of her children might discover what was under the bed. At the end of the day, she returned home. Everything was as she had left it, with Pablo's remains under the bed all day long. On Monday, July 19th, Maria got up very early, well before dawn. She loaded the heavy sack containing Pablo's remains onto her wooden cart and took it to a vacant lot in the southern part of the city to dump it. A few hours later, residents near the vacant lot noticed a terrible smell. The stench of decomposition was so strong that it reached the surrounding houses. At first, everyone thought it came from a farm about 300 meters away, but it did not. Not far from this area, a public sanitation worker was finishing his job collecting trash in 10 districts. As he was about to leave, 2 women approached him, asking if he could go to a vacant piece of land to pick up a bag they said smelled awful. The women accompanied him, and the 3 of them approached the spot. They immediately noticed a strong odor. Pressing a handkerchief to his nose, the sanitation worker walked up to the sack, which was labeled corn, contents 90 kilograms. The man tried to open the sack and feel what was inside. As soon as he began to open it, the smell became even stronger, and something strange emerged. He decided not to touch the bag any further and called the police. Police officers Juan Oliva and Miguel Romeo were the first to arrive at the scene. They opened the sack, and a swarm of green flies flew out. Then a human leg emerged from the bag. Surprised by what they saw, the officers reported their discovery to their superiors. They continued examining the bag and eventually removed the remaining body parts, only the head was missing. While forensic specialists conducted a preliminary examination, the police searched the area for the head. A few hours later, officers took fingerprints from the victim's hands. After intense work, the specialists were able to identify the victim through these fingerprints. They discovered it was Pablo Diaz, whose criminal record had allowed for rapid identification because his fingerprints were on file. Once Pablo's identity was established, the police went to the address where he was registered. His former neighbors said he had moved out and that he was living with a woman named Maria. The police then identified her as Maria Trinidad, who sold her goods in front of the La Paya bakery. The officers went to Maria's home, where they found her and her children. They asked if she was Pablo's lover, and she confirmed it. When they asked about Pablo's whereabouts, Maria immediately went pale. Noticing her reaction, the police asked her again if she knew where Pablo might be. She said she did not, adding that Pablo often stayed away from home for days and that she was sure he would come back soon. The officers exchanged glances, unsure whether to tell her that Pablo was dead. They decided that Maria seemed capable of handling the news. When she heard what the officers said, she didn't bat an eye. She merely closed her eyes. The officers had expected her to burst into tears or react hysterically, but she remained cold and indifferent. Suddenly, she opened her eyes, and one of the officers felt she already knew what had happened. Ultimately, they decided to take her to the station for a more thorough interview. Maria silently agreed to go with them without a word. At the station, the questioning continued. They asked Maria if Pablo had any enemies. Without hesitating, she said yes and added that Pablo had been very irritable in recent weeks and that someone had threatened him. The police asked if she knew the names of those who threatened him. She said she did not. After a while, the questions became more pointed. They asked if she had argued with Pablo. After a brief pause, Maria truthfully admitted that they argued frequently. One of the investigators asked if Pablo had abused her children, and she answered yes, without hesitation. She explained that Pablo did not love her children and that, for some reason, he would beat them, using whatever object was at hand to hurt them. She also told the officers that during their last argument on Saturday, July 17th, Pablo had told her that he intended to leave her, as if she were the one who had done something wrong. At that moment, one of the officers saw the chance to get the truth out and asked, "Is that why you killed him?" Maria hesitated for a second, then broke down. She looked at the officers and admitted that she had indeed killed him. The police asked Maria to explain how it happened. Now somewhat calmer and less tense, she told them everything that had happened from Saturday, July 17th, to Monday, July 19th, and what she had done. At several points in her story, she stopped speaking, cried, expressed remorse, but then continued and answered the investigators' questions. During the interrogation, it emerged that Maria suspected Pablo of having tried to assault her youngest daughter, Rena, who was only 10 years old. After the interview, the police searched the house where Maria and Pablo had lived. There, they found a saw, several knives, a baseball bat, and an axe. They also found Pablo's head in a container of sunflower oil under the bed. According to the investigators, it would not have been easy to dismember the man's body and dispose of it unnoticed, leading them to suspect that Maria might have had at least one accomplice. They focused on Maria's son Pedro, who was 17 at the time and had worked part-time at a butcher shop. The police believed the boy might have helped his mother dismember his stepfather. They also suspected Maria's son-in-law, who was married to her eldest daughter. Maria denied these theories from the start, saying she had acted alone the entire time. Nevertheless, the police employed every possible method to force a confession from either her teenage son or her son-in-law, but neither confirmed the suspicion. Some time after these horrific events, the trial took place. The prosecutor demanded a prison sentence of up to 40 years for Maria, citing aggravating circumstances and malice. Maria was ultimately found guilty of aggravated murder, concealment, and desecration of a corpse. After reviewing the case, the judge sentenced her to 40 years in prison. Maria said she was remorseful. During the trial, she stated she had killed Pablo because he mistreated her children. Maria Trinidad was released after serving 20 years. She spent the first part of her sentence in the women's prison in Pan, and 4 years after her release, she disappeared. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves. A man brutally murdered a soccer player and claimed he did it to protect his wife, but some false arguments led the police to wonder what the true motive for the crime was. When I opened the door, he was on top of my wife, she was screaming for help, I did what any man would do, he explained. The soccer player's mutilated body was found, and initially, the police were unclear about what had happened. However, as the investigation progressed, it emerged that the young man had taken photos with another man's wife, and some of these images ultimately led to his death. Today, we will discuss a case that took place in Brazil. Daniel Correa Freitas was born on January 24, 1994, in the state of Minas Gerais, Brazil. The young man began his sports career at the age of 13 and became a famous soccer player. He played for several teams in the country's second division and was even part of the U17 national team. The young man played for the São Bento Sports Club and was a fan of the São Paulo Football Club. On October 27, 2018, Daniel's body was found in São José dos Pinhais, a city in the Curitiba region. A resident walking through a eucalyptus grove discovered the man's body and reported it to the authorities. The body showed clear signs of violence. The forensic examination revealed that the soccer player had been tortured. The victim had numerous bruises and wounds all over his body, and his genitals were mutilated. The cause of death was a knife wound to the neck. Since nothing was found at the crime scene that could aid the investigation, the police decided to find out who Daniel had spent his final hours with the previous night. Although the investigation began just a day after the body was discovered, the player's press office immediately released a statement on social media saying Daniel had been murdered. The police started questioning people who knew the young man well, teammates, friends, and family. In one of these interviews, one of Daniel's friends gave investigators a crucial clue about the reasons behind the crime. The young man said that he and Daniel had been texting via Messenger on the night of October 26 and into the early hours of October 27. In the conversation, Daniel told his friend that he had gone to Curitiba to attend the birthday party of a young woman he knew, who was turning 18. In the texts, Daniel made it clear to his friend that he was strongly attracted to the birthday girl's mother. The texts read as follows: "I'm going to spend the night here. There are several women sleeping in the house. I'm going to hook up with the birthday girl's mother, and it doesn't matter that her father is somewhere nearby." That was the message Daniel sent to his friend on the 26th. His friend replied, "You're crazy, he'll kill you." Then Daniel sent 2 photos showing him lying in bed next to a blonde woman. The police believed that identifying the woman would be the key to solving the crime. The investigators were determined to find out who the woman in the photo Daniel had sent was. It turned out her name was Cristiana Brits. In 2018, 35-year-old Cristiana Brits and 38-year-old Edison Brits Jr. were a Brazilian couple who had been in a relationship for 20 years and were raising 2 daughters. The older daughter was named Elana, while the identity of the younger daughter was kept secret since she was 11 years old at the time of the events. Edison was considered a successful businessman, and thanks to his work, the family could afford a luxurious lifestyle and flaunt their status in public. The Brits family lived in the Brazilian state of Parana. On October 26, 2018, Elana, the couple's eldest daughter, threw an 18th birthday party in Curitiba, the capital of Parana. The party was attended by dozens of invited guests, most of whom were celebrities and members of Brazil's elite society, models, actors, and soccer players. Among them was 24-year-old Daniel Correa Freitas, who had known the family for a long time and had often attended Elana's birthday parties. According to statements the police gathered from party guests, the night of October 26 went perfectly normally. Everyone had been looking forward to Elana's party for weeks, and naturally, the attendees had a great time. In the early hours of October 27, the party, which included a disco according to some reports, ended. Some of the young people drove to the Brits family estate to continue the celebrations in a more private setting. Among these 15 people was Daniel. After learning of this, the police visited the family to ask some questions. They likely already knew that Daniel and Cristiana had been in bed together, but the family's statements could provide additional information worth considering. During the questioning, the police noticed how contradictory the couple's statements were and how absurd their excuses and justifications seemed. All of this added further doubts and questions to the evidence already obtained from participants of the private gathering. These interrogations led the authorities to suspect that the family was somehow involved in the young man's murder and emerged as the main suspects. On October 31, 2018, for days after the body was found, Cristiana Brits was arrested. She was sentenced to 30 days of pretrial detention necessary for the investigation to continue. The reason she was arrested first was obvious: she was the woman in the last photos taken on the night of the party. Shortly afterward, on November 3, 2018, Edison and Elana received the same punishment as Cristiana. A recorded statement from the two was released and broadcast by a local TV channel. In the video, Edison Britz Jr. can be heard confessing to killing Daniel but claiming he did it to protect his wife. In a segment of the interview, the man says the following: "I went into the room, the door was locked, he went into the room, undressed, and locked the door. I broke down the door to my bedroom. When I opened the door, he was on top of my wife, she was screaming for help. What I did, anyone would have done, because that woman wasn't just my wife, she represented all the women of Brazil. I've been married to Chris for 20 years. According to a statement Edison Britz Jr. gave to the media, the following happened on the morning of October 27, 2018. Everyone was getting ready for bed, Alana's birthday party was over, and everyone wanted to rest. Edison headed to the marital bedroom when he heard his wife's desperate screams begging for help. According to Edison, he heard the screams coming from one of the rooms and forced the door open with all his strength. When he entered, he found Daniel in his underwear on top of his wife. According to Edison, Daniel had tried to rape his wife. Edison lunged at him, started choking him, and shouted that he hated him for his betrayal and for breaking the trust he had placed in him. Daniel began to fight back, and a brawl ensued. Due to the noise, other party guests came over to see what was happening. Edison asked 3 young men to help him put Daniel in the trunk of one of the cars. They agreed and drove Daniel to another location that also belonged to Edison. There, the soccer player was beaten, and his genitals were cut off. Then he was beaten for a few more minutes, and the attackers put him back in the trunk and got into the car. On the way, Edison checked Daniel's phone and found the pictures he had taken earlier. The man became furious, stopped the car, pulled the young man out of the trunk, and stabbed him fatally in the neck. The wound was so severe that the coroner described it as an incomplete decapitation. The body was left in the woods, and the accomplices went home. Edison named the young men who helped him: 19-year-old Eduardo da Silva, 19-year-old Igor King, and 18-year-old David Ban da Silva. Edison's version was corroborated by his daughter, who said she had gone to bed that night with a friend named Evely Brasova when she heard her mother screaming. She went to check what was happening. However, other party guests didn't agree with Edison's version of the story. In their opinion, the husband had caught his wife and the soccer player in bed together in their underwear, which enraged him, but there was no attempt at violence. These weren't the only contradictions in the witness statements the police were able to collect. The investigators found it strange that the family denied knowing Daniel closely. The murdered man's mother told the investigators about his friendly relationship with Alana, and her words were easily confirmed by correspondence between him and Alana, as well as shared photos of Daniel with her, including some taken at the birthday party the previous year. At the same time, members of the Britz family claim they knew the soccer player personally, but that there had been no romantic or sexual relationship between him and Alana, or between him and Christiana. Alana, the eldest Britz daughter, also told the police how harmonious her parents' relationship was and how often she had observed their loving interactions. However, a thorough examination of the couple's phones suggested otherwise. More useful information was found on Christiana's phone. It turned out that shortly before the incident, she had contacted several divorce lawyers and had even scheduled a meeting with one of them. Everything pointed to her wanting to leave her husband. Several messages Christiana had sent to her friends were also found on her phone. These texts suggested she was unhappy in her marriage. What shocked the authorities most, however, was that the messages exchanged between Edison and Christiana were completely uncharacteristic of a happy marriage. These messages were aggressive and insulting. In one message, Christiana wrote to her husband, "It's high time you came home. Who's the woman behind you? What's this nonsense? I'm going to leave you, you're not worth it, you'll pay for this." Edison's reply was, "I hate you, get out, leave, I wish you were dead." The man sent such messages almost daily. Investigators speculated that Christiana and Daniel were having an affair, though this was never confirmed due to a lack of evidence. After charges were filed and additional individuals involved in the incident were arrested, the police conducted a reconstruction of the events. The three young men who had helped Edison with the crime told the police he had threatened them and forced their assistance in killing Daniel, saying they had no choice. Alana, the Brit's daughter, claimed that the three young men, not her father, were the most violent toward Daniel. Edison and the three young men were charged with murder, concealing a body, perjury, and corruption. Christiana was charged with unlawful manipulation, perjury, and corruption. Alana and her friends were charged with perjury, fraud, defamation, and coercion. Shortly afterward, Alana and her friends were released on parole since the trial was still ongoing. A few weeks after her release from prison, Alana gave an interview to Brazilian television. In this interview, she said the greatest victim in the whole case was her mother, who had been confronted with a traumatic situation, an attempted rape. She also noted that any man in her father's position would have done the same. Alana stuck to her belief that Daniel had tried to rape Christiana and that Edison was only protecting her, even though other witnesses present in the house that morning provided a different version of events. As for Daniel and Christiana, the police refused to believe they had a romantic relationship or sexual intimacy that fateful night. The investigators believed Christiana was so drunk that she fell asleep in bed. Since Daniel was likely very intoxicated as well, he went into the room, saw Christiana lying in bed, and decided to play a prank on his friends to show off a non-existent trophy. He lay down next to Christiana and took selfies with her. Who would have thought this prank would cost him his life? It was 2021, and the verdict for Daniel's killers was still pending. For the time being, the accused was only ordered to pay $0 in compensation to the soccer player's family since he was raising a minor daughter. A trial before a jury was scheduled for the near future, but due to a pandemic, everything was postponed to better times, and no trial date had been set. The only thing that can be said with certainty is that Edison Brits was found guilty of murder. Overall, the case is considered solved since it is now known who killed Daniel. The guilty verdict is still pending, and it could take a long time because quarantine and other restrictions have delayed all proceedings longer than usual. If the Brazilian justice system decides that the crime should be tried by a jury, the witnesses will have to wait a while until the necessary arrangements are made to accommodate as many people as possible in one room so that all witnesses, including the prosecutor and the defense attorney, can testify. At that point, Daniel's daughter will receive financial compensation for her father's murder. There's no doubt that Edison Brits committed this horrific crime out of the hatred and jealousy that consumed him. Daniel and Christiana had sex that night, nothing violent happened between them, but Edison came in and simply took the man's life. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves. At the beginning and in the mid-1990s, children began to disappear in Colombia. Some of them were found, but others were never found. The most shocking thing was that this did not happen in one particular place but in different regions of the country. At first, the police treated each of these cases separately. Every place where children were missing had its own law enforcement authorities investigating the cases. I do not know whether there were similar cases in other cities. Over time, the number of victims increased, and the police grew suspicious. They did not know what was coming. All the victims were boys between the ages of 8 and 14. They all came from families with low social status and lived in poverty. These children had to work to support their parents, and many of them sold candies and lottery tickets to pay for their schooling. It all began in 1992. There were ever more reports of missing children in 70 municipalities. The entire territory of Colombia was affected, and even the capital was alarmed. Law enforcement authorities worked day and night to inform the families about what had happened to their children, but over time more questions than answers arose. As already mentioned, each missing person was initially handled separately. That changed in 1977 and 1998, when mass graves were found containing children's skeletons. Many of the skeletons were missing their skulls, so there was a belief that some of the victims had been decapitated. The first grave was found in Risaralda, in the city of Pereira, the capital of that region. There, a gruesome discovery was made. A young boy was riding a horse in Risaralda when he suddenly discovered a burial site filled with many bones. It was unclear whether these bones were human or from animals. The police arrived and examined the site. It turned out the bones were human. The worst part was that the bones were very small, so it was concluded they belonged to children. Naturally, an investigation had to be conducted to verify this. During this first excavation, about 14 skeletons were found. Soon, in a nearby village close to the first grave, more graves were discovered. One of these graves contained 12 skeletons but only 9 skulls. All the skeletons still had bits of skin and clothing, but one detail stood out. Many of them had a small rope or rope fragments around the neck area. It was a shocking find. Law enforcement authorities had to compare this with previous cases to see what they were dealing with and began to connect one thing with another. Early in 1997, they found another grave in a place called Villa Olímpica, which was also in the Risaralda district. They found 4 children's skulls, and there were more graves like it. Altogether, by that point, they had found 9 graves with 42 skeletons. It was determined that the bones had been in the ground for about 5 years. Graves were found in Valle del Cauca, Antioquia, Bogota, and in India. In Valle del Cauca, there were 2 more discoveries afterward. 7 more children were found in Tolua in 1994, but there was no thorough investigation. It is also known that in November 1994, in Cartagena, a grave with the same number of children's skeletons was found. Apart from the task of finding those responsible, the police had another big problem. They had to identify all the children's remains. Only skulls and some bones were available. It was extremely difficult to determine exactly to whom they belonged. A DNA test was needed for that, and at the time these tests were very expensive. There were so many children's remains to identify and not enough resources. So they decided to turn to experts to reconstruct faces from skulls. However, that was very difficult, and back then there was no standard way to reconstruct a child's face from a skull. The problem is that children's facial features are not yet fully formed as they grow up. Only in puberty can one determine the shape of the face, the distance between the eyes, and the size of the nose. An expert began measuring all facial features to find some kind of pattern. After a few weeks, he succeeded in reconstructing the faces of many children. It also helped that the children's faces were very androgynous, and he could use the morphological norms that applied to women. However, not all skulls were available, and some were in very poor condition. For them, the police had to do a DNA test, and although they gathered a lot of information about the children, many families could not be found. To this day, the identities of many of these children remain unknown. After the police recovered the children's faces, they had to focus on the investigation. It was established that everything had started in the Risaralda district. They began to wonder what all these settlements had in common. Nothing was known about the murderer. The police did not know if it was a man or a woman, nor where to start. They only knew that all the victims were about the same age, and after reconstructing their faces, they found they also resembled one another in appearance. The same ropes were always used, and a bottle of liquor of the same brand was found everywhere. In some cases, traces of paraffin were also found. At that point, no one knew what they were dealing with. There was speculation that it might have something to do with satanic rituals. It was also suspected that it could have been a criminal vendetta. The possibility of social cleansing was also considered. These hypotheses were quickly discarded, and the police began to realize they were dealing with a serial killer. Days and months passed, and on February 6, 199, another murder was reported. This time, a child was found in Palmyra who resembled the earlier victims. Many details were found at the crime scene: shoes, glasses, and a bundle of money. Tests were carried out in a laboratory, giving the police many clues and leads about who the suspect might be. The shoes were men's shoes, so they assumed the murderer was a man. The right shoe showed unusual wear on the heel, which suggested that the man limped on that foot. The front part of the shoe was not worn out at all, so it was assumed the shoes were one size bigger than the man's actual foot size. From the wear pattern on the shoes, it was also possible to estimate the man's height at about 165 to 170 centimeters. They analyzed the glasses, especially the lenses, to determine the kind of eyesight the man had and to estimate his approximate age. According to the specialist who analyzed the glasses, the man who wore them could have been between 40 and 45 years old or between 55 and 60. The police therefore settled on a range of 40 to 60 years. Now at least they had some characteristics of the suspect. The banknotes were also useful. Based on the serial number, it was possible to trace where they were sent first, namely to a city on the Ecuadorian border. Transactions using these banknotes were made throughout Colombia. It became evident that this man traveled a lot within the country. Finally, the police had everything they needed to narrow down the circle of suspects. The police used a list of known rapists whose features matched those mentioned above. In the end, there were 25 suspects. There was also something else. The place where the body was found showed traces of a small fire, suggesting that the murderer might have burns on his leg, arm, or on the right side of his body. With all this information, the police began to track down the 25 suspects to find out where they were at the time of the murders. The first person to be arrested was Pedro Ramirez Garcia, nicknamed Pedro Pachuca. He had an extensive criminal record that included, among other things, robbery and child abuse. At the time of his arrest, he was wanted in connection with the disappearance of 2 children who belonged to the same age group as the other victims. One boy also identified him as his rapist. Pedro Pachuca claimed he was not guilty of the murders he was accused of. He was only guilty of abusing a boy who recognized him and two others who were missing. He maintained he had not traveled around Colombia in search of children to harm. The arrest of Pedro Pachuca did not bring peace but rather increased uncertainty. While Pedro was in prison, awaiting the results of the investigation, 4 more children were found in Bogota. The police had to drop the charges against him. Pedro Pachuca was the first person to stand trial for these crimes. In the first year of the investigation, the police in each district had their own suspects. The same happened in Bogota. In 193, a man named Javier Garcia Trejo was arrested. The mother of one of the missing children said she had argued with Trejo about a piece of land and that he might have taken revenge on her. He also looked like someone in a photo taken by a girl who had seen him with one of the missing children just hours before the child disappeared. Trejo pleaded not guilty. He spent a year in prison awaiting trial and suffered greatly there, for even before he was jailed for violence and murder of minors, other inmates wanted to take revenge on him. He described being mistreated there. He was released in 1994 because a hair analysis showed he was not involved. But there was a miscarriage of justice. Before the hair test, the court had already convicted him, so he had to return to prison and spend several more years there until everything finally came to light. Later it turned out that Javier Garcia Trejo had come face to face with the real culprit. After Pedro Pachuca was proven innocent and there were no other suspects, the chief investigator in this case moved to Bogota. Until then, he had been investigating from Pereira. There, he began to look for recorded cases similar to the most recent missing child case. He found the case of a 12-year-old boy named Ronald Berra. He had been abused and murdered, and the details of the case were very similar to those of the case under investigation. This incident occurred in Pusa, 60 kilometers from Bogota. In Ronald's case, there were witnesses. Some said they saw the boy talking to a man hours before he disappeared. They were employees of a cafe near the spot where the boy's body was later found. Based on the descriptions given by these men, a photographic image of the suspect was created, and the police were able to find him. His name was Luis Alfredo Garavito. This man had only recently arrived in town. Not many people knew him. But during the interrogation, they found nothing that would indicate his guilt. He had an alibi, claiming he had been at a bar nearby with friends. No one could confirm this, but there was no evidence against him, so the police had to let him go. After that, the investigation hardly moved forward. The investigator noticed that Alfredo Garavito was born in the town where he believed the murders began. He also listed his address as being in Tolua, the city where a grave had been found. Moreover, he matched the suspect's profile perfectly. He wore glasses, was the right height and age, and appeared on the list of 25 suspects. Because of the Ronald case, his exact whereabouts were unknown. The decision was made to check the last address in his file. It turned out to be his sister's address. She said she had not seen him for a very long time, but that during their last meeting he had left behind the bag full of his belongings. The sister allowed the bag to be searched. Inside, the police found a wealth of incriminating material, diaries in which Garavito wrote about each of his victims, according to the police, and listed the names of many missing children along with dates and places. There were also newspaper clippings about the disappearance of children. The more the police investigated Alfredo Garavito, the clearer it became that they were dealing with a murderer. In the bag, they found a receipt for a money transfer that Garavito had sent to a friend living in another settlement. The police traced the friend's address. She said the man had already left and that she had not heard from him for a long time, but he had left a small suitcase there. Inside the suitcase were more diaries and newspaper clippings. They found many items pointing to Garavito's guilt. He was clearly very interested in these cases and had noted down specific dates and places in his diaries. The suitcase also contained religious books, a Bible, a book on Satanism, and a book on natural healing methods. There were also bus tickets that helped establish the approximate route the man had taken. It became apparent that, after leaving his victim in Palmyra, the man traveled to Peru. The investigators returned to Peru and began questioning pharmacies and hospitals to see if a man with burns had recently been treated. An employee in a pharmacy said that recently a man with a leg burn came in who was not from there, and she had never seen him before. After he was treated for the burn, the man did not come back. Even though the police acted together, too much time seemed to have passed for them to apprehend the man. They tracked Luis Alfredo Garavito but lost him in Buga. They did not know if he was still there or had moved on. More news came in from Ecuador, near the Colombian border, where the bodies of children were found displaying the same characteristics as those in Colombia. It was concluded that the man had extended the area where he committed his atrocities. Until April 22, 1999, there was no new information about this case. In Villavicencio, east of Bogota, a boy named Ivan Sabaca went missing. His mother went to the police to file a report. The child had gone to the park in the morning to sell lottery tickets, but he did not return at noon as he always did. The mother was very frightened and decided to go to the police with her husband. Both parents were told they would get help. That very night, the police received a call from a young woman who worked at the bus station. She said a boy had arrived, partly undressed and looking very distressed. She said the child had asked for help, claiming that a man had wanted to do something terrible to him, but he had been saved by a homeless man. That was Ivan's story when the police brought him back to his mother. He said that on that day at the park, while selling tickets, he was approached by a middle-aged man who offered him money for a job in the countryside. But when they arrived at the place, there was neither money nor a job. The man told Ivan to enter a thicket, where he told him to undress and began touching him. At that moment, a homeless man who had followed them realized what was going on. The boy started to scream, and the homeless man grew alarmed. He began throwing stones at the man, who ran away, and the homeless man and the boy ran to the bus station to ask for help. As Ivan and his mother, accompanied by police officers, headed to the station to make a statement, a man emerged from the bushes. The boy recognized him immediately. It was the same man. The officers asked him several times if he was sure. The boy said yes. The man was taken to the station for questioning and arrested. He said his name was Bonifacio Mararu and showed his ID. It struck them that he resembled Luis Alfredo Garavito very much, who was wanted throughout Colombia. It was also noted that the man's signature looked different from the one on the ID. He signed about 5 documents at the police station, and each time the signature was different. The man also matched the suspect's profile. He was the right height, the right age, and had the appropriate physical traits. Moreover, he occasionally limped on one leg. However, Bonifacio was not on the list of the 25 suspects. Initially, the police could not charge him with all the offenses they were investigating. They could only imprison him for the offense against Ivan, and there he waited for his trial. At that time, all the investigators working on the missing children cases gathered in Bogota. When they saw the photo of Bonifacio, they realized that it was indeed Luis Alfredo Garavito. The man looked almost exactly the same. The problem was that they did not want him to know they were already onto him. They had to do a DNA test to confirm a match. The man was examined by an ophthalmologist to see if the glasses found at one of the crime scenes matched him. While he was at the eye doctor, the police went to his cell and took some hairs from his pillow. They then took his fingerprints and compared them with those of Garavito. The results of all the tests showed that Bonifacio Marrero was in fact Luis Alfredo Garavito. A Dutch program that was very advanced for its time showed all the places where the murders happened, as well as the locations of Garavito and the other 25 suspects. The program showed that only Luis Alfredo Garavito had been in all the places where the crimes were committed. There was no doubt they had arrested the worst child murderer in history. The police wanted him to confess. Most importantly, they wanted the man to tell them where the other children were, as the number of victims was already very high and the police were certain there were more. It was therefore crucial to get Garavito to admit he had committed all these crimes to find out if there were any others he had harmed. That was very difficult. In the first interrogations, Garavito seemed rather carefree. He showed no emotions, let alone remorse. It was extremely difficult to get a confession from him. The police started looking into who Luis Alfredo Garavito was, where he was born, where he grew up, and when he stopped being a normal person and turned into a monster. Luis Alfredo Garavito was born on January 25, 1957, in Genova, Colombia, into a family that lived in the countryside picking coffee. It was a large family. Garavito was the oldest of 7 brothers. His father's name was Manuel Antonio Garavito, and his mother's name was Rosa Adela Ubez. Manuel Antonio was known to be very strict and cruel with his children, especially with Luis Alfredo, perhaps because he was the eldest, or for another reason. Luis Alfredo Garavito said his father often beat him severely. He also once said that his father frequently abused him, taking him into the bathtub under the pretense of washing him, but in reality he touched him and forced him to touch him as well. Garavito said this experience had a major impact on his life. He also said he was abused by a man he knew, a friend of his father's who owned a pharmacy. At that time, his mother took him to this pharmacy for medical checkups, and the man took advantage of the situation. Garavito said this man not only raped him but also stabbed him with a knife, beat him on his arms and legs, and burned him with candle wax. According to Alfredo, this went on for 2 years, until his family moved from Genova to Tolua. Even after that, his life did not improve. He said that another friend of his father's also started abusing him, coming at night to his family's house and taking the boy to meadows and other remote places to abuse him. Alfredo said this also had a major impact on him. When he was a teenager, he began to feel attracted to his younger brothers. He wanted to do the same things that had been done to him. He was 15 years old when something terrible nearly happened. He was at a train station when he noticed a boy who caught his eye. Alfredo told him he would pay him if he helped load some things, but he actually took him around a corner. The police heard the child's screams and quickly came to his rescue. Although he did not succeed in harming the boy, he was arrested for attempted assault. Because he was a minor, they called his father, who used violence against him that day, telling him to look for women if he wanted to do such things. From that day on, the relationship between father and son worsened, and as a minor, Alfredo left home. That was how his life on the road began. He said that in his early years after leaving home, he had a lover with whom he supposedly had a son. Later investigations revealed the child was not his, but he treated him like his own for several years. He also said that, over the years, he rarely had the chance to have relationships with women. He began to believe he only liked men, but he kept quiet about his orientation for fear of not being accepted and of being mocked. Besides that, he could not talk about his attraction to boys. After separating from that woman, he moved to another place and left her with the child. He went to Armenia, a city in Colombia, and started a new life there. That was when his appalling path truly began. On his way to work, he saw children sleeping on the street. He offered them money for his own satisfaction. He drank heavily, and by age 23 he had to enroll in Alcoholics Anonymous, where he allegedly received psychiatric help that supposedly cured him in 14 days. That was far from reality. Luis Alfredo Garavito kept drinking. He had a routine: go to work, then drink, then roam the streets at night looking for children. This continued almost every day. He said that between the ages of 20 and 30, he did this with at least 200 boys. At the age of about 29, he reached the peak of his criminal activity. He went to an AA center once more, this time for the last time. After 38 days, he was released with the diagnosis that he was healthy. He then started drinking compulsively and, at nearly 30 years old, committed his first murder. Luis Alfredo said that on that day, he drank in a bar near a park as usual, when he saw a boy who caught his attention. He offered the boy money for a job and took him to a remote area. The boy walked slowly, and along the way the man managed to enter a shop to buy 3 things: a knife, a rope, and a bottle of strong liquor, the same type of bottle and the same rope found at all the crime scenes. Although he said he only brought the knife and rope to intimidate, at some point he struck. Then he realized it gave him great pleasure. He inflicted more and more wounds on the boy until he stopped breathing. The name of his first victim was Carlos, and that was the start of a 6-year nightmare that affected all of Colombia. After committing this crime, he traveled across different neighborhoods of Bogota. The first murder took place in 1992. By 1993, he had refined his methods further and became even more brutal. He no longer simply picked up any boy in the park but tracked his victims. He knew where they lived, what their parents' names were, and who they worked for. He knew whether the children had brothers or sisters. For him, it was a hunt. He moved around the entire country without arousing suspicion. He disguised himself as a homeless man or as a priest to deceive people in the villages and earn the children's trust. In his diaries, he recorded everything he did: dates, names, places. He kept meticulous notes. These diaries represented the life of Luis Alfredo Garavito over the past 6.5 years. He said he tried to join a religion because he felt bad about what he was doing. He tried occultism, Satanism, and other alternative religions, but none could free him from his criminal drives. He said he wanted to take revenge on the world for all the things that had happened to him as a child. He claimed he inflicted on his victims the same wounds that had been inflicted on him, especially with candle wax. Very often, he took candles and lighters and burned them. According to him, the same was done to him as a child. When he finally confessed everything and revealed where he had buried more victims, it became clear that the number of victims was up to 200, plus another 200 children he said he had not killed. In total, that made 400 victims. He was called the worst child serial killer in history. He also said that he did not operate only in Colombia but also in some Ecuadorian cities near the Colombian border. Though it was a very sensational trial, and he was charged with many crimes, the sentence imposed on him was not strict enough. Supposedly, he was sentenced to more than 1,800 years in prison for all his crimes, but due to certain laws, the sentence was reduced. First, there is no life imprisonment in Colombia. No one can spend their entire life in prison, unless of course someone dies in a fight or another incident. The maximum sentence is 60 years. Of these 60 years, a further 20 years were deducted because Luis Alfredo Garavito cooperated with the police and told them where the other graves were. The prosecutor was thus required to reduce his sentence, which it did. In the end, the man was left with only 40 years to serve. The sentence was pronounced in 2001, but now there is another problem. There is a law that allows prisoners who have reformed to be released after serving 60% of their sentence. Because of all this time Garavito has spent in prison, he can now be considered reformed. He began attending church, was baptized in prison, claimed he had changed, and that he deeply regretted his crimes. He also finished high school, and combined with his good behavior, he was an ideal candidate for release after 60% of his sentence. The law does not say that it cannot be applied to inmates who have committed violent crimes, so Alfredo Garavito will definitely try to use this option, and his lawyer is working on it. The criminal gave 2 major television interviews, one for Spanish media and one for Colombian media. In one of these interviews, he claimed he suffered from erectile dysfunction and had never raped the children he killed. That was strange, since in another interview he said the opposite. Garavito contradicted himself many times in these 2 interviews. In 2023, Luis Alfredo Garavito can apply for his freedom. Many people see this as disrespectful to the families who are still mourning their children. It is also disrespectful to the victims, both those who are no longer alive and those who are still among us and suffering from the consequences. There are also indirect victims, not only the children and their families. As you may recall, there were people who went to prison for these crimes. For example, a man named Garcia Tinoco spent a long time in prison for a crime committed by Garavito. Nearly 4 years. Tinoco had, without realizing it, crossed paths with a real madman. This happened in prison, and that was where they also met. Tinoco said Garavito asked him for forgiveness. Naturally, the man replied he could not forgive him because he had ruined not only his life but also those of many children. Because of the way other inmates treated him, Tinoco developed schizophrenia. Although he was released from prison, he could not live a normal life. He could not find work or money. Often, he slept in dumpsters or under bridges. He took lots of medication. He was no longer the same person. After his release, his lawyer filed a lawsuit that secured him compensation of $1 million, but according to Carlos Garcia Tinoco, he has not seen a single cent of it. Now he lives by begging for alms, selling used items, and doing odd jobs. His life is completely ruined. Luis Alfredo was given many different nicknames: El Monstruo de Genova, La Bestia, the Beast, the Priest. What has not changed is the damage he did to his victims. That must be kept in mind, because he might be free again soon. Right now, he is doing everything possible to get out of prison. He is quite certain he will succeed, and it is very likely that he will commit crimes again and look for young victims. He could be released in 2023, at which point he would be 66 years old. He has been kept in isolation, is well fed, and appears in good health. It is unlikely that other inmates have beaten him because he was in isolation. He is allowed to use the phone 6 hours a day. He can speak to his lawyer. Many believe that if he is released from prison, he will be killed unofficially, but no one knows what will actually happen. Clearly, he would have spent only 2 months in prison for each person he killed. That is obviously not enough. The families of the victims tried to prevent his release, because Luis Alfredo Garavito instilled terror across the entire country. This is one of the most horrifying cases, and not only are Garavito's crimes shocking, but also the injustice that he can be released after such a relatively short time in prison. Many people will hear about this, and one can only hope he will not be freed. The relatives of the murdered boys are fighting for that. He says he has changed, that he has found faith in God and has been baptized, but many believe this is just a pretense to show he is a better person now. Many also believe that evil in this form never leaves a person. We will never know, because on October 12, 2023, at the age of 66, Luis Alfredo Garavito died in the hospital in Valledupar. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourself.